Today on BRStv, we're talking calcium reactors, and on top of that, we're going to let all of you vote on if we're going to use one on the BRS160 using YouTube's new card feature. Hey guys, my name is Ryan. Welcome to another week of the BRS160, where every week we do our best to help you guys, members of the reefing community, enjoy your tanks and find new ways to explore the hobby. We do that by following the setup and progression of this 160-gallon reef tank. We're getting close to adding corals to this tank where we can really start to see it evolve each week, so bear with us while we cover a few last major elements related to setting up a reef tank like this. This week we're going to dive into that last major element associated with maintaining calcium and alkalinity, calcium reactors. We'll cover how they work, benefits and challenges, the main components of a reactor, and then show you exactly how to set up this Vertex calcium reactor on a system like the BRS160. If you've made it this far in the 52 Weeks of Reefing series, you already know that corals consume calcium ions and components of alkalinity called bicarbonate and carbonate to create their skeletal structure, calcify and grow, because we've basically beaten this important concept to death. If this is something that you missed, check out week 29 where we cover all of this in detail. It's an important concept for every reefer to understand if they ever want to have a thriving reef tank full of colorful growing corals. In the last 2 weeks, we covered those chemicals that can replace the calcium and alkalinity with two-part and kalkwasser. Now it's time for calcium reactors, which are just a cooler way to do this. The concept is super simple. We're going to fill a large container with pieces of coral skeleton, which are primarily composed of calcium carbonate. We're then going to bubble small amounts of carbon dioxide into the chamber, which creates carbonic acid and dissolves the old coral skeleton into its primary components of calcium and carbonate ions. We then drip the liquid from the reactor into the tank, which contains these elements, to add calcium and carbonate alkalinity to the tank. Honestly, it's simple as that. Melt the dead coral skeleton into its individual components living corals can use for their own growth. I find the concept really attractive because it seems like a very natural approach to reefing. So here are the main benefits to calcium reactors. I think the biggest one is you're adding calcium and alkalinity in a balanced approach. So you really only need to test for one, which is typically alkalinity. In a vast majority of cases, as long as your alkalinity is on track, the reactor will keep the calcium levels on track as well. That doesn't mean that you don't need to ever test for calcium, but I'd say you could do it much less frequently. Next, because the reactors melt in the entire skeleton, the fair assumption is all the trace elements bound up in the old coral skeleton are released and dosed to the aquarium as well. While I think this is accurate, any trace elements that are used for other biological purposes other than calcification are likely not dosed by melting calcium reactor media. A good salt mix and solid water change schedule is likely all you need to maintain the others unless you want to do something fairly advanced. Calcium reactors also have a cool factor that fuels the gear junkie in all of us. I don't think there's a cooler piece of equipment you can put on the tank. The technology impresses guests, looks awesome. There's a sense of satisfaction you get from tuning the reactor and getting it set up properly that's unique to this type of equipment. Lastly, calcium reactors have no effect on salinity like two-part does, so if you're someone who doesn't do a lot of water changes or have a very large system which doesn't allow for significant water changes, a calcium reactor might be a better option. There are a couple of things people often pitch as advantages, but I think there's a healthy amount of room for debate on. Starting with, once you get a calcium reactor tuned in, they require less maintenance than other solutions like two-part or calc. I'd say this is highly dependent on the quality of the reactor setup you purchase, particularly the quality of the valves in charge of your CO2 bubble rate and the valve in charge of your drip rate onto the tank, as well as your regulator. So in some cases where you get the best gear available, there'll be almost no maintenance. In other more affordable cases, you'll probably have to tinker with the bubble and drip rates as often as you have to mix two-part jugs or calc. Calcium reactors are also pitched as lower cost in the long run because the calcium media is lower cost than kalkwasser or two-part. I'd say the math used to prove this is a bit murky and mostly based on an era before bulk two-part and kalkwasser existed. Most reefers won't use more than $30 to $60 in chemicals a year, so the payoff versus a $500 calcium reactor setup is pretty far out. However, retail calc and two-parts are like 5 times as expensive, so that could easily pay off in a handful of years if you use those type of chemicals. Startup costs of a calcium reactor will vary with the type of equipment you buy, but I'd say $400 to $1,000 is average. The average user will spend a bit over $100 a year in replacing calcium reactor media, filling CO2 containers, and replacing pH probes. The payoff equation typically assumes that you get 5 to 10 years from your reactor. It's possible, but most reefing gear is replaced long before that due to wear, upgrades, and accidental breakage. Betting on 5 to 10 years of use of any item submerged in salt water is closer to a long shot than a sure thing. There are several advantages and cool elements associated with calcium reactors, but I don't think lower cost is really an accurate depiction of the average install. There are also two main disadvantages I see over other solutions, starting with the obvious complexity. Honestly, I think anyone who's engaged in reefing in their tank enough to watch a series like 52 Weeks of Reefing can easily understand how to get this thing running. So most of the complexity is really about the rest of the family or a friend operating it when you're away or on vacation. It's rare that they'd have to touch it, but it would be really hard to tell them what to do other than simply turn it off. Another disadvantage is the effluent drip rate from the calcium reactor is acidic by nature and will lower the pH of your tank. While your tank can be healthy anywhere between 7.8 and 8.3, the corals will likely calcify and grow faster, closer to 8.3. Almost all the calcium reactor setups run closer to 7.8. There is a way around that by dosing kalkwasser in your auto top-off to keep the pH elevated and making up for the rest with your calcium reactor, but you've added another level of complexity to the system and you should know that going into it. There are 5 main components to most calcium reactor systems: the calcium reactor itself, the reactor media, CO2 canister, regulator, and pH controller. End of the day, the reactor itself is a fairly simple piece of equipment. Other than the size, the biggest differences are just build quality and a few features. Larger reactors are able to hold more media, which means more surface area to melt and the more calcium and alkalinity you can dose to the tank. I'd say most common reef tanks up to 200 gallons or so can get by with the smaller end of the range like a Skim CM122 or Vertex RX-C. Tanks around 75 to 100 gallons can probably get by with a 4-inch version like the Reef Octopus line. I'd really only consider larger reactors if I had a tank over a few hundred gallons. Build quality is half about the pump, with the Seche on the Vertex probably performing the best, closely followed by the Eden pumps on the Skims and the water blasters on the Super Reef Octopus. In general, the price points kind of tell their own story here, with the standard Reef Octopus being the entry-level reactor, which should have related expectations for build quality. The Skims and Super Reef Octopus step up their game in relation to this, but the Vertex really stands out in the crowd with welded PVC acrylic body, flow valves, needle valves, and machine components. It's really not even a close call. The list of features to consider on a reactor are simple things like a quality bubble counter, secondary chamber for additional media to gas off CO2, flow meters, and space-saving designs. One of the biggest ones here is that second media chamber. The low pH of the effluent from the reactor will flow over the media to gas off any excess CO2, which will minimize the impact the reactor has on the tank's pH. There are differences between the media types as well. I think the most popular is the Two Little Fishes Reborn media, which is basically little coral fingers. Most reefers like this media because it's obviously a very natural source, and the larger pieces stay put and allow for good flow through. Carib-C makes a whole variety of different natural calcium carbonate-based medias in all kinds of sizes. The difference in size is the smaller grains will provide more surface area and increase the amount of calcium and alkalinity dissolved and dosed to the tank, but it also compacts and clogs the reactors a lot easier. The largest medias will have less surface area, so less is dissolved, but they rarely get clogged and hence lower maintenance and easier to use. Lastly, the synthetic medias like the one made by Elos is a much purer form of calcium carbonate. One of the things about natural calcium carbonate, like coral skeleton, is they have whatever the coral took up, which means it does have some amount of phosphate and potentially other pollutants that were in the ocean at the time. This isn't usually a big deal as far as phosphate is concerned because it's just a tiny, tiny fraction in comparison to the foods we add to the tank. But if you want the purest media around, Elos is your best bet. One other common calcium reactor media is magnesium carbonate, or products like Zeomag. This will replace the magnesium that is used up in processes other than calcification. Next components are your CO2 regulator and tank. You can pick up a brand new tank from us or another store and get it filled at many welding, home brewing, or paintball shops. A new one is always nice and shiny. However, you can just as easily get a used one from these shops and swap it when it's empty. The tank regulators marketed to the aquarium market in general are average in quality and a little touchy when it comes to the adjustments, but they're low cost and that's what most people are looking for. There are some easier to adjust ones like the carbon doser, which electronically varies the bubble rates, which are nice, and you can also find premium regulators all over the net if you want to spend the extra money. However, if you use a pH controller to limit the CO2, you might not need the absolute best regulator out there. You can use a pH controller to monitor the acidity of the water inside the reactor, and it'll open and close the solenoid to control the amount of CO2 added to the reactor. The standalone pH controllers like the Milwaukee are affordable and nice. I have to say that I like the standalone ones because they're easy to look at and make adjustments to, but almost anyone who's a big enough gear junkie to set up a calcium reactor will also have a complete aquarium controller like a Reef Keeper or a Neptune Apex. End of story. If I was going to put a calcium reactor on any tank in its range, I'd use the Vertex reactor for sure. It's built awesome, looks awesome, and has awesome features. We're going to go ahead and completely install this unit on the tank so you can see exactly what's involved in setting up a reactor, as well as why everyone here at BRS likes the Vertex model the best. So while most of the calcium reactors out there are the same basic design, they all have some unique differences, so you're going to want to make sure to follow the instructions that come with yours. We're going to give you a basic rundown of how this one gets assembled. So the first step is to rinse all of your calcium reactor media. You can do this in tap water. I typically use a strainer like this one from OXO. I also like to use the Zeomag to maintain magnesium levels and mix it in with the regular calcium reactor media. The Zeomag says to mix it about 10 to 30% of the total mix. If you use a 4,000 gram bag of Reborn like this and 1,000 gram of Zeomag, that's about 20% of the mix and probably perfect. You'll probably need 2 bags of each and you'll have some left over. When you're removing the lid, make sure to grab it by the body and not the manifold here, which could break. Inside the reactor, there's a titanium screw on the perforated plate. Grab that and you can remove it. Then we'll add our media. The Vertex reactor does require coarse media, but some of the smaller particles will probably make it through the perforated plate on the bottom, which is totally okay. You don't need to fill the reactor completely full. In fact, I'd probably stop about 1 inch below that supportive ring here, and then replace your perforated plate. Before you add the top back on, inspect the threads in the O-ring to make sure there's no particles that would prevent a good seal. Next, you're going to add the reactor to the countersunk base. Note that it's not actually attached here, which allows you some flexibility to assemble it in different styles that may fit your sump area better. Next, we're going to install the CO2 reaction chamber and CO2 media. First, you want to rinse it under some tap water. Once it's rinsed, add all of your CO2 media to the reaction chamber. You may not need to use all of them, but once it's full, go ahead and attach it to the manifold. Just attach it loosely. We're not going to tighten it down completely yet. The purpose of the media and reaction chamber is to help increase surface area and contact time to help dissolve more of the carbon dioxide in its first pass through the reactor. This is one of those features that's fairly unique to the Vertex calcium reactor. Next, we're going to install the recirculating pump. It's pretty easy to see the orientation that the pump is installed in because the rubber feet will go into the nested holes in the mounting plate. Once you have it securely in place, twist on the locking plate and tighten your union. Once that's done, you can fully tighten the top of the CO2 reaction chamber. Next, fill the bubble counter with water and place in the acrylic holder. Then use the titanium screws to attach your flow meter to the bottom bracket of the bubble counter. Next, we're going to install the secondary media chamber, which is actually 2 additional chambers because you can disassemble it in the center. Most people are going to fill the secondary media chambers with standard calcium reactor media to gas off the CO2 and raise the pH, but you could fill it with other types of media like Zeomag. However, most people find that the Zeomag actually dissolves better in the main body. Some reefers will also like to fill this smaller reaction chamber with large particle phosphate removal medias like those from Eheim. We already have plenty of Zeomag in the reactor and I'm not overly concerned about the phosphate issue, so we're going to fill both of these chambers with standard calcium reactor media. Once you have it reassembled, you can place it back in the mounting plate. Note the cutout that's there for the push connect fitting. The last piece to install before we start cutting tubing is just the needle valve, which is installed into the bubble counter's bracket. The reactor comes with 3 different colors of tubing, so you can color coordinate them. We're going to use red for all the internal connections, black for the CO2 connection, and white for the water connection. You can cut the tubing with a sharp knife, but a few dollar investment in an RO tubing cutter is a good one. It makes a nice, sharp, clean edge. The first connection we're going to make is between the output of the bubble counter and the CO2 input on the manifold of the reactor. Note the tubing guides on the bracket here, which is going to make for a nice clean install. Go ahead and insert this into the push connect fitting that doesn't have the red pipe on the other side. The next piece of tubing we're going to install is to collect the excess CO2 that collects at the top of the reactor and recycle it back into the manifold. Note that there's 2 push connect fittings on the top here. One of them has an attachment on it that ensures that it draws fluid from below the surface of the water. What you want to do is attach to the other one, which is going to be on the very top of the lid and allow it to suck up all the gas. The next step is to attach some tubing to the bottom of your secondary media reactor, run it up through the tube harness and attach it to the other port in the top of your lid. Then attach some tubing to the top of your secondary media chamber and into the needle valve. Then attach a piece of tubing to your flow meter through the tubing guide and into the top of the needle valve. Again, we decided to use white for the water line, so go ahead and attach this line to the top of the flow meter. This will be the effluent that drips the calcium and alkalinity into your tank. We'll also attach some white tubing to the top of the manifold here, which will be for our feed pump or water source. And the last connection we'll make to the reactor will be the black line for the CO2. I fed it up through the tubing guide, and we'll push it into the push connect fitting on the top of the bubble counter. We use a fitting that has the red tubing on the other side. The assembly of the reactor is complete now. All we need to do is install a regulator, CO2 canister, and pH controller. The next step is to attach your pressure regulator to your CO2 canister. I'd follow the instructions from the manufacturer. We're using the Milwaukee version here, which is fairly inexpensive but worked well for us in the past. Most regulators will have two gauges on them, one that reads the internal tank pressure as well as one that reads the output pressure. To set the output pressure, you'll need to plug in your solenoid so it opens, as well as open up the gas a little bit, and then set it to about 12 psi. So one important note about all this is carbon dioxide is a poisonous gas in excess, so it's important to follow all the safety guidelines that are in the instructions for the reactor, as well as the regulator and tank. And when you bring the tank in to be refilled, have them inspect it for safety. Once you have the regulator set, go ahead and shut off the tank or unplug your solenoid and attach the CO2 line from the reactor to the regulator. Note that this model does have a bubble counter actually installed in it. We don't really need to use two, so I'm going to go ahead and rely on the one that's on the calcium reactor itself and leave this one empty. The last thing we need to install is the pH controller and probe. The probe is going to go into a port on the top of the reactor. Just insert the probe down a few inches so it's fully submerged and screw down the locking nut. We're using the Milwaukee external controller here, but again, you could use the Reef Keeper or Neptune Apex full aquarium controller if you have one. What we want to do is control the powered solenoid here. So we'll plug it into a controlled power source. Now based on the pH, this will open and close the CO2 valve. Vertex's instructions tells you to set the amount of CO2 entering the reactor to achieve a pH of around 6.3 to 7.2. Where you end up setting your reactor is really more about the media that you put in the reactor than the reactor itself. Some of the medias require lower pHs to dissolve properly. This Reborn is really right about in the middle between 6.5 and 6.9. The other part of this is if you only have a medium demand tank, you might not need to run it that low. You could actually run it in the low 7s and then reduce the impact that it has on the pH of the tank. For our reactor, we're going to start at about 6.8. This will allow the carbon dioxide to bubble into the reactor and melt the media until the pH inside the reactor drops below 6.8, at which point it will trigger the solenoid valve and shut off the CO2 supply. One important note is we're not going to rely solely on the pH controller to control the amount of CO2 entering our reactor because the probe or controller could fail. We're also going to adjust the bubble rate. Using the needle valve on the CO2 regulator, you can adjust the amount of CO2 that's bubbling into the reactor. The Vertex instructions suggest one bubble about every 2 seconds or 30 bubbles per minute. Note that that's just a starting point because we have to fine-tune the reactor to your individual tank needs. The last piece of this is we need to supply water to the reactor and hook up the water feed line. We're going to move all of this over to the sump area and hook it up to the manifold we installed earlier. You can also use pretty much any standard pump that's capable of pumping water through the reactor. Most of the smaller CJ lines are perfect for that. Many people attempt to use peristaltic dosing pumps for this, but the affordable ones aren't very good for applications like this because they don't do well with varied flow rates or back pressure, and the motors have limited lifespan, so they won't last as long. We have the reactor fully installed here, water flowing out the manifold to feed our reactor and CO2 bubbling. Note that we also added a check valve right after the regulator to keep salt water from backflowing into it. Just as a reminder, based on the Vertex instructions, we have the CO2 bubbling at about 30 bubbles a minute, which is about 1 every 2 seconds, and the effluent drip rate into the tank at about 180 milliliters a minute. Note that air bubbles can collect on the flow valve, which can impact accuracy, so it's a good idea to tap them off and check it by just letting some water flow into a measuring cup with milliliter markings like a beaker and noting how much water is collected in a minute's time. These flow and drip rate settings are unlikely to be to the exact settings for your calcium and alkalinity consumption, and you'll need to adjust them up or down. To adjust the addition of calcium and alkalinity down, there are 2 ways you can do this. You can leave the flow rate alone and just reduce the amount of CO2 bubbles to say 20 a minute or 1 every 3 seconds, which will increase the pH inside the reactor and reduce the amount of calcium reactor media dissolved. Alternatively, you can also slow down the flow rate of the effluent from the reactor going into the tank from say 180 milliliters to 100, and this will also reduce the amount of calcium and alkalinity added to the tank. However, it is important to note that as you slow down the flow rate of the effluent, you'll also need to reduce the bubble rate of the CO2 as well, or the pH is likely to drop below the ideal range and dissolve too much of the reactor media. If it falls too far, the media will just turn to mush. In our case, we have a pH controller maintaining the ideal pH inside the reactor, so this is less of a concern, but we still want to manually adjust the bubble rate so it's close to correct, just in case the pH controller were to fail someday. If you want to increase the amount of calcium and alkalinity you're adding to the tank, you should increase the drip rate of the effluent and add more solution to the tank. Increasing the flow rate through the reactor will also increase the pH inside the reactor, so you'll likely have to increase the amount of CO2 you're bubbling into the reactor as well. Just keep an eye on the pH controller and increase the CO2 bubble rate until the pH falls within the range you're looking for. Keep in mind all these changes happen slow, so give everything a few hours or a day to stabilize before you make additional changes, and remember that the flow of water through the reactor and the amount of CO2 bubbling in the reactor are closely related to each other, the resulting pH inside the reactor, and how much calcium and alkalinity you're adding. It's obviously pretty important to monitor calcium and alkalinity levels daily when you first start using a reactor until it's tuned in. I'd say you really only need to measure alkalinity daily, and you can test calcium once a week or so until it's stabilized. You can also test the alkalinity of the calcium reactor's effluent to test its potency, which can help you understand how the reactor's working and tuning it. The tank's DKH is likely around 8 or so. The effluent of the calcium reactor might be between 10 and 20 DKH. Because many brands of test kit don't go that high, you might have to dilute the sample. So if your test kit calls for 10 milliliters of tank water, use 5 milliliters of tank water and 5 milliliters of RODI, and then double the results you get. Depending on the kit, this might not be perfectly accurate, but it's close enough for this purpose and way better than just guessing. If your calcium and alkalinity levels are off to start with, it's almost always better to get them back in line using 2-part calcium chloride or sodium bicarbonate in the Reef calculator first, and then use the calcium reactor to maintain these levels. Doing it this way will drastically reduce the amount of tweaking you need to do in the beginning. If the pH of your tank ultimately ends up below where you'd like it, you have a few options, starting with just opening up a few windows in your home. You can increase gas exchange by increasing flow with a few new pumps, add a refugium with plants that take up excess CO2, add a CO2 scrubber media to the intake of your skimmer, and finally use kalkwasser in conjunction with your calcium reactor, because the kalkwasser will effectively remove much of the excess CO2 the calcium reactor adds. Hopefully all of this was helpful in understanding the basics behind how a calcium reactor works, and now that you do, it's time to vote what we actually install in the BRS160 using the new YouTube card pull in the upper right hand corner. Last week we said we were going 2-part because it's so darn easy and inexpensive, and in this hobby, easy means successful. This week it's hard to resist putting this Vertex reactor on the tank because everything about it is just absolutely awesome. We can't decide, so we're going to go with what you think we should put on the tank. Stick with the 2-part and dosing pumps, switch to a calcium reactor alone, or implement a calcium reactor kalkwasser combo which keeps the pH up while maintaining the benefits and coolness factors of the calcium reactor. Calcium reactors are a big topic, but we tried to cover as much as possible this week. I hope you picked up at least one new thing related to calcium reactors. If you did, give us a quick thumbs up after you place your vote and subscribe. See you next week with the final component of the calcium and alkalinity mini-series we did within the BRS160 with week 33, pH and trace elements.